Hello, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be here. I've been looking forward to this for many days, and I think it's going to be fun for all of us. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father,
Heavenly Father,
Divine Mother,
Divine Mother,
friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to share your presence, to feel your blessings, to receive in our hearts and in our minds your guiding wisdom. We are your children trying to find our way, at times through a dark and difficult world, at times effortlessly in the light of the sun. Be with us every step of the way. Help us to feel your living presence, to hear your guidance, to know that we are walking with you, following your lead into the infinite light of bliss. Om, peace. Amen. Well, my friends, today's topic, which is coping with change, just is enormous. And there's just absolutely there's no, what do I want to say? There's no small way to talk about this subject. It's just a giant subject, and there's just a whole lot about it. I was reflecting on something that Swami talked about. He said, when Master was teaching them, the disciples, not the public he would teach differently, but the disciples, he talked to them almost all the time about right attitude. Because if the disciples developed right attitude, then everything else that they needed would follow naturally. Because right attitude just sets us up with the understanding of what the purpose of life is and how we can respond to it. And we naturally, and we'll have time to discuss sort of all the different ways in which Divine Mother challenges us very specifically. But the unifying, underlying, important point on all of it is that when we have the right attitude toward our lives and the right attitude toward the spiritual path, then that's about 3/4 of the battle. Much of what we're struggling with a lot of the time is that we really just don't have the right attitude about it. I was remembering when I came onto the spiritual path, there's so much excitement. There's so much, I don't know, it was just so thrilling, especially moving to Ananda village, starting a whole new way of life. It was just marvelous. And I think I've joked with you because Master talked about a portable paradise, that you could have a portable paradise inside of you. And I somehow thought that in 5 years I would. Why I made that decision, I don't know. It was completely made up. And 5 years into the spiritual path, when when the horizon line had just spread out so far in front of me, it wasn't in any way that I was discouraged, but it was just so different than I had expected. You know, there was just I just had so much more to learn than I had any way of knowing. And I would say that has extended till yesterday. It hasn't happened today because today it's early in California. I just haven't had enough time, to be humbled yet today, to be but give me a few more hours and I'm sure perhaps it'll happen through the course of this. But we were a group of nuns. That was my first 10 years. Wonderful group of women working together. And we used to laugh about just, we were too far out from shore to turn back, but we hadn't reached the other side of the lake yet. And we were growing a little weary of the swim, basically. The way we joked about it is like we sort of all got together and started treading water and talking about our options. There was just like, but what were our options? Because not only were we too far from shore to go back, but nobody wanted to go back. But we hadn't reached our goal. And, in the illusion of things, the goal was a whole lot farther away than we thought. And I mean, I've gotten much more subtle in my understanding even of where the goal is and what it looks like and all of that. But in those years, it was a sufficient shock. It was enough. But those were very, very important turning points on the spiritual path, much more important in retrospect than I realized at the time, because it was a question of deciding what my attitude was going to be about the reality of the spiritual path. Was I going to spend a lot of time being disappointed, rebellious, guilty, feeling worthless, losing hope? These are all very serious questions. Someone once asked Swami, what was the secret to success on the spiritual path? And he said, realizing that it's a matter of life or death. And that was a very dramatic answer. Swami was not usually given to dramatic answers. But it was, what's the secret of success? In other words, there isn't an alternative. And if one examines one's life, honestly, certainly I found this to be true. I realized a lot of what passes for what I think of as intelligent reflection is actually just looking for an alternative. Just hoping that if I keep sort of examining this same question over and over again, I'll find a way that this alone is not God's will. That this is the one single exception in all of creation, that everything happens by God's will, except this particular thing that just happened to me. Or that all of the karma that I've accrued through countless lifetimes, that, I don't really have to work through it. I can just skip it, just kind of go around it in some way, that I don't have to really climb the whole mountain. I can just be transported to the top. And when I've come to appreciate that I just have to do it, and that my attitude has to be one that there is no alternative, that alone has been exceedingly liberating. And a lot of what I feel that I do when I talk to people on the spiritual path is to try to help them to think clearly enough about their own thought processes to realize when we're simply just looking for a back door, or imagining that I don't have to do this. I remember in one very difficult transition that I was in my life, I had this tremendous amount of anger going. And some of it was directed toward people, other people who in various ways had not behaved in the way that I would have chosen for them to behave. But I realized that the quantity of my anger was too great for them. It wasn't really about them. I finally actually realized that I was extremely angry at every single one of the masters in Swamiji, just all of them. I was furious. And my fury was really weird, because I felt that what was happening to me was justified. I saw my own part in it. I recognized my own karma. What annoyed me was it was going to be a very, very tough climb, a very tough climb. And I knew that I was going to make that climb, and that at the end I would be done. But I was just so angry that I had to do it. And I was angry at them. I was angry at them because I knew that I had to do it. Does that make any sense? I was just furious because it had to be done. And it was a matter of life or death. The only way to have life was to go through what I had to go through. And I just didn't want to. I was mad at them for creating a universe of this type. Why did you have to make a universe like this? Master said that he argued with Divine Mother about teaching her children through pain. Why do you make your children suffer? Master said. And I always thought to myself, well, if Master could complain about it, I can certainly complain about it. And of course, he apparently never changed her point of view. But nonetheless, we can be crabby about it. However, in the end, and even once I actually knew the reason for my anger, it became easier to overcome. I don't say effortless, but easier because it was so pointless. I was going to do it anyway. If I was going to do it anyway, I remember when I was a child, it was interesting to me. I was thinking about this recently. I don't, it's not that I disremember my childhood. It was very happy. I have lots of, the feeling of it was a very happy time. I was very fortunate in my birth family. But I have vivid memories of a few moments from time to time through it. And it's interesting to me what I do remember. And one was being, I don't know, maybe even a toddler, quite small. And I had a shelf of toys in my memory. And only recently did I realize that even though that shelf in my memory was about as big as a large car, the chances are it was probably just a small bookshelf because my parents didn't indulge me like that. I must have just had a few toys on a shelf. And I was seized. This has been typical of my whole life, with initial enthusiasm that commits me farther than I really want to follow through on. So it was very typical as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. I took all the toys on my shelf and I dumped them out into the middle of the room because I was going to organize them. This was my thought. And just yesterday, I had all the food in my cabinet out on the table because I was organizing the shelves. And I had the same thought. I didn't want to finish, but I did finish because I've grown a little since I was 3. But anyway, there I was. I pulled everything out. It was all piled on the floor. And then I lost interest because that's part of my nature, initial enthusiasm, and then I lose interest. Used to be part of my nature. And I just went to do something else. And of course, my mother, who was quite attentive to raising the 3 of us, she came in and saw the mess I created and brought me back and told me I was going to clean it up. And I just suddenly went into this state of, like absolute anguish that this thing was going to be asked of me, that I had to put these toys away. And I remember just sitting among these heap of toys. And I remember picking them up one at a time. Children can be so, I'm sure my parents laughed when I wasn't in the room. I picked the toy up and I did that really fake cry that little children do. Like this, and I would move the toy really slowly, and then as if it were very heavy, I would drop it on the shelf and then I remember all this, then gather myself together to pick up, the next little item, and then repeat this dramatic cycle. In the middle of that, somewhere, something inside of me said, "What are you doing? Just put the darn toys back on the shelf." Just like I don't recall what I did after that, but I vividly remember just another part of me saying, "Come on, girl, just do it." And the two parts of me were just at war, just like that. Just because we're young and small and can't speak whatever language we're supposed to speak, we're exactly who we are. The consciousness, your consciousness is fully there. It just acts itself out in whatever little games you have. But that, to me, it's like one of the reasons I remember that, because just every day, just yesterday, looking at all the food that I pulled out of the cabinet, it was exactly the same reality. I don't want to do this. This is too hard. I myself created the mess, but I don't want to fix it. I want someone else to fix it. I've had enough experience now, and the issue was tiny. I said, just put the stuff back, and I just spent, 10 minutes just putting it all back, and it was just fine. I'll tell you another one, which is also recently, which was just insane. Now, these are trivial, and I know that we have a much more serious subject here, but attitude is expressed in every action, every area of your life. And wrong attitude is often hard to attack if it's a really big issue. But if it's a big attitude, it's also a little attitude. And sometimes we build our victory skill in small ways, and then that gives us the power when it becomes big. I have a profound and deep aversion to housework. I'm now 73 years old, and I've almost never had to clean my own house. And I consider this to be a great victory at this point. I've managed one way or another to have either the people I'm living with do it, or I've worked and hired somebody to do it. I don't ask me why, but it's a very deep aversion. I just about anyway, it's big. I really, and I'm accepting that I will probably die with this aversion, and that's just the way it is. So when I was writing, Light Bearer, I went to stay in the cabin that belongs to Kirtani and Anand. They have a cabin, have a house, a small house in far northern Washington, right up by the Canadian border. It may be available for seclusions. I mean, you're a long distance from it, but it's a fantastic seclusion place. So I'm living in this little house. It's a little 1-bedroom. It was a prefab house. It's very nice. It was brand new. I actually was really the first resident. They'd hardly stayed in it themselves. So everything was perfectly pristine. There was there was no one I could hire to clean it when I left it. I tried, but there was no one I could hire to clean it when I left it. And Ananda and Kirtani were coming. I had to leave it spotless. I was there for weeks, so I really had to. And there was a bathroom that had to be cleaned. And my particular focus after vacuuming is bathrooms, cleaning bathrooms. So the whole second half of my seclusion is always in my mind that I'm going to have to clean this bathroom. And I'm embarrassed to tell you how much I thought about having to clean that bathroom and how large it loomed in my mental sky as this unbearable task that had to be done before I left. So finally, the day before I leave, I go in there to clean the bathroom. And I'm not kidding. It's just a small bathroom. It took me 8 minutes. 8 minutes to clean the bathroom. It was like, oh my gosh. I'd spent probably cumulatively hours thinking about it. Now, friends, sometimes it takes a lot longer than 8 minutes. And sometimes what we have to go through is truly horrible, because a lot of things happen in our life that are truly horrible. But I remember just when Swamiji was having terrible ill health once, and he was in Europe. I went to Europe to see him, and I said, "Sir, how are you feeling?" And he smiled at me like this. He says, "Oh, compared to eternity, perfectly fine." Just like whatever it is that we're going through, there's an end point, and that end point is eternal bliss. And compared to that, everything is 8 minutes or less. Now, see, this is all about attitude. Now, then, once you're in the middle of a difficulty, you have concrete issues to deal with. But resistance is one of the reasons why change is difficult. I have a very practical nature, and one of the things that Master said to Swamiji is that you have to be practical in your idealism. And one of the principles that has really made Ananda successful is that we're very practical. We have very high ideals, but we're not dreamers. Swami taught us not to be dreamers. And he taught us to just accept things as they are, and then you'll know what to do. I was thinking recently of there's a story of a man, many of you probably know it, they made a movie of it and there was a book. The man who went out hiking by himself and got himself wedged into a rock. He got his hand wedged into the rock. Probably all of you have heard about that. And he was there for a number of days before it occurred to him that he could cut his hand off, which sort of came to him in a super conscious way. As I recall, he had a sort of dream or a vision. He was, of course, in an altered state by that point, of himself married, playing with his child, but he only had one hand. And that was when he realized that he could just sever his own hand, which he did do. And then many things happened and he's gone on to have his life, but just with one hand. So I think about acceptance, because Swami always says the first thing you have to do if you're going to effect and face any kind of change is you have to accept that this is where I am. So if you think of something graphic, like a person now only has one hand, and there it is. And you can lie in your bed and wish that you had two hands, but you don't. And there's a certain point at which acceptance is not what I would say, not acquiescence. It's not collapsing in the face of it. It's not becoming content with the status quo necessarily. It's just saying that from this point forward, I have to figure out how to live with just one hand and, and a forearm. So what's possible now? So all of us at the present moment, in the last 7 months have been caught in this chaotic change that maybe some people saw coming, but certainly most of us did not. And when it started, just speaking of this, it had the nature of a short-term emergency. And I think we've all gone through cycles. I certainly have gone through cycles of recognizing that this is not a short-term emergency. I was thinking about World War II, and just war is another kind of global event. But the boys will be home by Christmas, and then Christmas comes and they don't come home, and the next and the next and the next. Just how many times in human history, or somebody has an illness which appears to be acute but turns out to be chronic, right? Or somebody you love has a substance abuse problem that you think you're just going to rush in and solve, and it turns out to be chronic. We can have a desire for a way of life that gets taken away from us. And when we started this, it was a short-term emergency. I mean, there was sort of all this adrenaline, everybody got these emergency measures in place. But then the change started shifting into week after week, month after month. And we have to start thinking about acceptance. We have to start thinking not about as soon as this acute episode is over, everything's going to go back to the way it was. I heard political writers. I read about political writers talking about the word, they were talking about Britain exiting the European Union. And they were talking about how clever that word exit is, because you think you go in the door and you go out the door, and then when you come out the door, you're going to be in the same place that you were when you went in. And so it sounds like, it's a simple thing. We walked in, we walked out. But of course, when you walk out, 40 years have passed and the whole world has changed. And there's no possibility ever in any circumstance of going back. I mean, nobody is the same person 5 minutes later. And the experiences have changed us, and everyone has changed, and world circumstances have changed, or whatever, everything has shifted. So this is where attitude comes in. Do I get my security from this illusion that I can stop the only certainty in life, which is that nothing will stay the same? Or am I basing my security on, because there is an unchanging reality, but that unchanging reality is not external. Now, from a point of inner strength, this is what I was saying about acceptance is not passive. When that man accepted that he only had one hand, there was a whole lot of things he started doing. I mean, a person would do. You start, who am I now, and how do I train for this new reality? And there's a lot to do, and there's a lot to train for, but you can't train for having only one hand unless you accept that you only have one hand. And so that's the super hard challenge. Then we can develop coping strategies that are what I would call generic coping strategies that can be applied to every challenge. And those are the kind of coping strategies that you need to develop when it's easier. We can rise to them in the moment, but if we have practiced when it was easier, that was Swami's advice to me when I asked him an extremely complicated question about what would be the right response in a very challenging situation. He said, what you're saying is that then in a moment of crisis, how do you know what God wants? And he said, you need to practice when it's easier, because it's not always so simple in the moment of crisis to be able to suddenly intuit God's will. So a generic coping strategy is working against resistance, your own resistance, working on realizing that forces that are beyond our control need to be dealt with as they are, not as we wish they are. And on a much deeper level, getting into the habit of not feeling alone. We're just practicing sharing our life with whomever you wish to share it with, a master, an angel, divine mother, however it is that you want to share it. So that when something really unexpected happens, somebody asked me yesterday, as it were, what does it look like? She asked me, when you surrender. She was asking me personally. And I said, this is what it looks like. Swamiji, what are we going to do about this? And I mean, it was an interesting question because I never actually thought about it. I'd never thought of it in quite those terms. But I've been in the habit all my life of talking to Swami. And for many years, we could exchange emails or I could talk to him on the phone. Now, it's the conversations, I have to work harder to have them. But that would have been the way I handled everything. Sir, what are we going to do? I'm up against this. What are we going to do? And surrender is an odd word, but it means to cooperate rather than to resist. That's what it is. When you're in war, you keep shooting and then you finally surrender. And then all of a sudden somebody else is in charge of you. You won't necessarily be made a prisoner. You might just have your bow and arrow or your rifle taken away from you and you'll be sent home. But in some way you have to cooperate with something that you were trying to resist before. And you have to accept that you've been defeated. Been defeated in the sense of, I had my plan and now it's been defeated. I'm just not gonna have it. So, sir, what are we gonna do about this? So I would open it up to comments or questions. And I have some questions already. I don't know if we have any typed in. I'd rather just have a discussion at this point. Do we have anything that people want to know? I have also some on an email.
I think, Asha, one thing that, as you were talking, that came up for me, and this is sort of, I think, something, I always call it primordial grief. I deal a lot with that, no matter what's going on, but then there's certain circumstances that bring that up in me. And as you were talking, and you were, saying, not resisting and accepting and all that, that I realize in myself there's this sort of purgatory of primordial grief in that process too. And I wondered if maybe you could speak to that. That's
a very good question. That is a really good question, Maitri. And it is, I think in many ways, it's the question. I mean, you speak of being aware of it. I've not been a person, I've not had a lot of personal experience with depression. But I know that people who do just sort of have this lurking sort of darkness that wants to pull their minds down. Let me think about this. I'm going to take it from the grief question first. I think depression is a slightly different question. I felt in my life that tremendous impetus for the personality and the way I moved through the world, not so much in the last decade or 15 years, but prior to that, was that I had to be aggressive enough to stay ahead of a kind of, you called it primordial, I would just call it accumulated past life heartbreak. If there's a peculiarity that I cannot figure out, that time will make an intense suffering less intense. Even though the experience, there was nothing good about the experience and it never worked out. It was a death, disappointment, betrayal, whatever it was. It was never righted, but enough other experiences came in front of it that you're not as acutely conscious of it. But the blow is still there. And the wound is still there. So what I have come to feel, and I think there's metaphysical truth in it, over many incarnations, we just accumulate these heartbreaks, and they get to be really big because there's so many of them. Because inherently, human life lived on the human level is always going to be a disappointment, because death and change are inevitable. And we will always be suffering until we turn to God. And this is like one of these essential attitudes we have to understand. It doesn't mean that God wants us to be miserable. You have to get this very clear. You may have wonderful, charmed lives because you have very good karma, because you have very good attitudes, and we're generous, and we're divinely inspired, and we give. And so everything works harmoniously. It's not like you have to be miserable. But even at its best, the heart needs more. The heart needs to be with God. This is why Swami said we learn from being disappointed, but we learn more from having our desires fulfilled. Because if our desires are disappointed, we hold out the thought that if I only had that, if I could just have that, I would be happy. And so we don't turn to God, because if I just had that, I would be happy. That's why Master said every desire has to be fulfilled before you can attain God realization. So that means in the end, we get everything we want. And I've thought about that one a lot too, and this is what I've come to. There's no duality in the state of God realization. It's simply one. All thought, all desire, and I speak not from experience, but from glimpses and from the words of the scripture. Everything about us has to be focused entirely and only toward the divine, and that's what God realization is. If there's any lingering desire for anything else, then by definition, we can't be all for the divine. So all of these desires have to be neutralized. And if we wanted it but never got it, and thought we would have been happy if we'd had it, then it's going to be a ripple. It's going to be a vibration. But what happens when it's fulfilled is that we realize this is fine, this is nice, this is even beautiful, but it's not enough. And so then when we turn toward the divine, we're doing it consciously and deliberately, not not because the world has renounced us. As this disciple came to Ramakrishna and said, my wife has left me, I've run out of money, my children are gone, I'm going to become a renunciate. And Ramakrishna said, it's not you who renounced the world, it's the world that's renounced you. And so it's not as if we can just love God because the world has renounced us. That's not enough. We have to, of our own free will, put it down. And we don't put it down until we've experienced all the good that it has to give us, and then asked for a little bit more. So in between, at the stage of the journey, certainly that I'm walking on, I think there's just been a lot of heartbreak over many incarnations, because I was born, and this was sort of an odd thing to me, although the answer was obvious when Swami gave it. I just like my single desire from earliest age was that I really wanted to be happy. And when I finally came to Ananda, I said to Swami, it's so peculiar because I never was really unhappy. I was a light spirit. I had good karma. I was very well brought up. I mean, nothing much happened to me. Most of my life, nothing much has happened to me externally. I play it all out in my head. And he just said, well, past lives, obviously. So in past lives, we've lived through, either through fulfillment or disappointment, the experience of desire, and recognized its limitations. Not its evilness, but just its limitations. But But the magnitude of suffering that it takes for us to really let go of the hope that there's an alternative to the heroic effort required to overcome our egos and give ourselves to God, I think that grief just has to rise to such epic proportions that the effort to satisfy it eternally with God realization looks easier than enduring it. Because we never change. Never. We never change until the effort to change looks less terrible than what we're presently experiencing. And I wish that weren't true, but that's what I've seen in myself. We'll just endure it. Even if we know what the solution is, we won't put out the energy for the solution until that seems easier than continuing. And so the primordial grief that you describe, let me go one more step with this because this is important. The way when I realized that even though it was not identifiable and I didn't know where it was coming from, I didn't know what it was, I didn't know why I felt it, but my fear of it was ruling me. I was being ruled from the subconscious dark. And I was always protecting myself against that experience, if I can put it like that. Now, I have to add, I've never been prone to depression, so I know that this whole scenario can have a different way of playing. But I finally realized that I just didn't have to be afraid of feeling all that pain. That the effort to run away from it was much worse than just allowing it to reach me. And then going underneath it and realizing that the light of God was still there. It wasn't bigger than the light of God. I just thought it was. And that was what I learned from Swamiji. I used to think that Swamiji was running his life the way I was running mine. This is just natural how you would think. And the way I dealt with a lot of things was with using willpower to suppress. And I didn't know that, but that's what I was actually doing. So when I would see Swamiji able to weather storms, and God knows he had to weather a lot of storms, I just thought he was holding them at bay the way I was doing it. There it is, but I'm just going to make a wall of willpower between that feeling and where I am now, and then I'm going to be fine. But I actually came to realize that and the reason I would make that wall of willpower was because I was afraid to feel what was on the other side of the wall. I finally realized that Swami wasn't afraid to feel anything. He just was fearless. That was the only way I could describe it. He just was fearless. So when something was terribly painful, deeply disappointing, and his relationship with his Guru Bhais was, of course, the apex of all of that he had to go through. But there were countless strands off of that just never ending, literally to the end of his life. It was anguishing for him. But he wasn't afraid of that fact. There was no part in him that needed it to be different in order for him to be okay. It was just like, this is what someone remarked about another spiritual teacher that was actually expelled from his own ashram, and his own life work just went into a mess. It was very tough karma. It was during the 80s and the 90s when a lot of the ashrams were really in trouble. And this man said about this great teacher, he said it wasn't so much that he was going through a hard time, but that a hard time was going through him. And I actually realized that that's what I'd been watching when I heard that perfect articulation. That's what I'd been watching in Swami. He just allowed a hard time to go through him, and he didn't have to block it. So the grief was immense. The grief was cosmic, because the grief is cosmic. The Maya it's a cosmic delusion And it's extraordinary. And the suffering that people go through is stunning, myself and other people. But every master says, and I've had enough experience now to believe it, that what really endures is the bliss. And so why do I have to be afraid of this darkness? Now, what I've also found is that there's a metaphysical proportion. It's like our capacity to absorb is exactly proportional to how much is going to come through us. And that's one of the things we have to practice. I mean, generic right attitudes is that if God sent this to me, he's going to help me through it. And we will get through it. So I don't have to be afraid. Even if I am, I don't have to be. And that becomes the Swamiji, what are we going to do about this? Because it feels like too much. But I think that primordial grief is essential for God realization. Because first of all, until we become fearless in our ability to face what is, to accept what is, why am I afraid of recognizing how much I've suffered or how much the world suffers or how much others suffer? Why am I afraid of that? Because almost all of this all comes down to fear. I mean, I certainly have found for myself for a long time, what am I afraid of is one of the most useful questions I have. And I try not to answer it quick. And I definitely try not to answer it with some kind of spiritual platitude. Just like, what am I really afraid of? And say it, name it the way it feels to me, not the way I want it to look. And then why am I afraid of that? It will all come down to lack of faith in God. But it's generally not helpful to say that first. Usually you have to walk through a lot of the form it's taking before you can get there.
I know you once said to me in a discussion about that, and it was very interesting exercise to, when stuff came up, to ask that question and then to journal and follow the trail. It's very interesting where it will take you, and it just brings it into the light, basically brings it into your awareness, so then you can perhaps accept and give it to God in that way.
Well, for me at least, you need to know what you're accepting.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes what you've stuck it on is not really what your issue is.
Yeah.
Someone gave me another 3 questions, which I found very helpful. See the little green pieces of paper on the wall back there? That's one of them is on one of those green pieces of paper, and you'll notice its relationship to when I wake up in the morning. Anyway, it says, what is this feeling? I mean, because it's not even always obvious. What is this feeling? What is it trying? What does it want? In other words, why has it come to me? What does it want from me? And can I let it go? And the answer is not always yes. Often the answer is no, not at all. I have to hold on to this. And sometimes what it wants from me is it wants me to understand that what it appears to be is not what it is at all. That there's just many. Oftentimes we take an aggressive outward energy, for example, anger. I mean, just something so obvious. Anger can really just be a lack of self-worth. But you've made it really aggressive because it's too hard to make it inner directed. So what is it really asking of me? What does it want? And one of the questions that came on the email, I want to take a break in just a moment, but one of the questions that came on the email, which is a very important one, is when should we seek outside help? When do we need to go beyond the spiritual path? And many of us, many people really don't know where the pain is really coming from, because we've become very skillful at putting layers upon layers. So we have a whole story worked out, and the story is really not the true story. The story is just the one that is more comfortable for us than the true story, and it's either literally suppressed memories or past lives that we don't know what they're about. It can be many different things. And in order to really, you can't offer something to God that you don't own. You know, if you go into someone else's purse and make a big donation to Ananda, it's not really a donation to Ananda. It's somebody else's donation to Ananda. And with God, I have discovered in myself and seen in others that often we're offering God something that is really not us because we don't yet own our own emotional, personal life. We don't own it because we've just never been able to unravel it. And I have seen that there's a real need among many people, not necessarily for a long time, but to have a neutral third party, so to speak, because there's the truth, there's your idea of the truth. And then you may need a neutral third party to help you figure out what this is and where it's coming from, so that there's sufficient actual ownership of where what I really want, who I really am, where my pain is really coming from. And sometimes people come onto the spiritual path because there's a lot of unresolved heart difficulty, and they hear that I can just give it to God. And so that means I never have to unpackage this. I never have to actually accept or face or feel. I'll just take this black box of unresolved issues and I'll give it to God. Except you don't yet own it. And so you're trying to give away something that you haven't had the courage yet to work with. Now, I don't criticize that because what I've seen is almost invariably, and sometimes it's 20 years into the path, where finally now I have enough light and enough solidity on the spiritual path that I'm capable now of unpacking that box. But I've never seen anybody succeed without having to unpack it at some point. And whether or not, I mean, I suggested to you, and I've seen it be very helpful, whether you can do it just by journaling, whether you can do it by spiritual counseling, whether you can do it by meditation, but not necessarily, because it's just too hard to be objective about ourselves. You know, and you know, some psychological counseling just takes you deeper into the muck, and some liberates you. But in principle, people need help sometimes, and there's no shame in it. It's just like, I don't know where my pain is coming from. I need to have somebody else look at me and help me figure it out. You know, Swamiji would often speak in not a very positive way about psychological counseling, but he also really felt there was a real place for an elevated kind of counseling, which is what he called directional counseling, where you're working toward resolution in higher consciousness. You're not just moving around in horizontal circles. So it depends on what you're doing. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Asha, I want to say that's brilliant. What you said just went zing.
Oh, good. I'm glad of that.
And the concise part of what you said that zinged me was, of course I can give it to God. I know how to give it to God. I've given it to God. And now for the, whatever it is, fill in the blank, each one of us, it comes back to us. Oh, I'll give it to God after 3 more years. Okay, give it to God. But when we don't own it, then when we own it, we can truly give it away. That's when I see the surrender of whatever that is, the whole self, but of a situation or of a characteristic in the human. Brilliant. Sorry, I'm just had to say that. I got so excited because the black box is going to now have to be opened before I give it to God. I got it.
And that's why we often get hit really hard. And that's why I was saying a lot of my personality, and because I have had such a strong will, I could stay ahead of it. But, then the tests get harder. or the tests get bigger when we're ready, so that we can. Yeah, it's great good news when that happens. So I was going to suggest, why don't we take a chanting break, Maitri, if you're willing. Let's have a few minutes of chanting, give everybody a chance to stretch and do whatever else you need to do, and then we'll come back and continue. Yeah, energize, Supriya suggesting if needed. And then if you feel like typing in a question, go ahead. And otherwise we'll continue as we are. Okay.
It seems like to me that part of what you're saying is that how much we resist change comes down to how much we resist pain, right? To a certain extent.
Yeah.
And I remember years ago, you remember G. Gordon Liddy, the infamous Watergate conspirator. There were stories about how he had this practice that he would do that he called tuning up his will, where he would literally take a cigarette lighter, he'd light it, he would hold his palm over it until he couldn't stand it anymore. And, and he would literally char the flesh on the inside of his palm. And that's a rather extreme example, but I mean, maybe a little less extreme example is something that Maitri does in her prenatal classes, where they are back against the wall and they come down into a partial squat, and so the pain of those muscles having to hold you in that position for a long time starts to become rather intense after a while, and she talks to them about going through the pain, and I'm wondering how much value you think that something like that, a physical, having more of a practice to kind of get through physical pain, if that's useful when it comes to pain that's not physical, pain that's emotional or psychological.
Well, what you're actually describing is, think about traditional asceticism among monastics. Now, it's extreme in Catholicism, where there's this connection that you have to suffer in order to please Jesus, which is a terrible misunderstanding. But there is truth in it, and it's all ascetics of all faiths have always done things that other people would consider to be painful, that they do literally in order to train their will for exactly that reason. So there's tremendous validity in pushing your capacity to endure farther than you think you can push it, because then you discover that you have more strength than you thought you did. I mean, in one place, Master says, and this is so subject to misunderstanding that I always feel like I have to do a whole disclaimer before I say it, but he said, don't always feed your kids when they're hungry. Don't always put a sweater on them when they're cold. Just let them learn that they're tougher than they think they are. Now, of course, everybody reads that now as child abuse, but what he's really saying is you don't necessarily do your children a favor by every time they have a little desire, training them to think it has to be fulfilled. Now, if we exaggerate that, we know that that's true, that you have to train children to be able to face into things and do it. So the question is, where do you draw the line? But the line would be, and this would be very personal, what is actually making me stronger and not just making me perverted? Gordon Liddy's putting his hand over a cigarette lighter. I find that extremely interesting. Where did that come from? But if you think about how that could translate into all pain is temporary, and there's simply no reason for me to react. That's where, you don't eat that much and you're hungry, but that's fine. You're wearing something that's a scratchy hair shirt and it's just all right. You don't light your fire, you live in the cold, and you just learn that I'm not limited, I'm not small. I have the infinite power of the universe within me, and I can do anything that I want. These things are very unpopular now because everybody wants to be comfortable. But the principle of training your will, I think of it in a smaller way. which is, I think of it in terms of putting out more energy, no matter what is against you. And this is the way I suggest it to people. There's always less or more in every situation, that you could put out less energy, you could put out more energy. And I encourage people in every small situation to put out just a little more energy, because there'll be a point where you think, I've done enough. No, then just do a little bit more. It doesn't have to be hugely more, but just a little bit more. And if you constantly realize that I think I'm done, but I could do a little bit more, then you have begun to develop a generic attitude that by my will, I can always choose. Now, on Master's path, because we're going up into Dwapara instead of down into Kali Yuga, up into Dwapara, Master gave us the energization exercises. And if you think about the energization exercises, and now I'll quote the Festival of Light, whereas in the past, suffering and sorrow was the coin of man's redemption, for us now that payment has been exchanged for calm acceptance, for calm acceptance and joy. Now, how do we get to calm acceptance and joy? It says, whereas in the past it was suffering and sorrow, now it's calm acceptance and joy. That doesn't mean, oh, goody, from now on we have a free ride. It means that we can do it in a different way, but the capacity to be able to have calm acceptance and joy requires that we have mastery over our energy. I mean, and that's exactly what he was doing with the lighter. That's what a monk does by restricting his diet. That's what a Tibetan does by learning to sit in the snow. You know, whatever it might be, we have to become master of our energy. So in Dwapara Yuga Rising, the energization exercises, Master created those, which is very interesting. He didn't create Kriya, he didn't create yoga postures, but he actually created energization exercises. It's his original contribution to the science of yoga, because that's how we do it in this age, which is that we, instead of having to go through our physical bodies and torture ourselves and get the willpower to be tortured, we just work directly on the will and the energy. And so if you're, I mean, and this is in theory, but it's the theoretically true. If you're in physical pain and you're used to being able to direct your energy where you want to direct it, which then translates to being able to direct your thoughts where you want to direct them, then you can transcend physical pain because you've trained your will. You've trained your will and your concentration. So it's a much more direct way of accomplishing the same thing without having to torment the body to such an extent. Tormenting the body deliberately is a Kali Yuga way of doing it. But the goal of doing that hasn't changed. Just that we have a more subtle way. People fail to appreciate the potential of the energization exercises, the cosmic potential of getting good at them. You know, the sort of part of what we're doing.
We had a satsang a while back when we could meet together, where somebody had I thought, an interesting analogy or metaphor along those lines. She was saying how, you know, an obstacle or challenge would come before her, and she used to think, you know, it was just about her getting her will to, you know, push through it. And then she realized that it was more about her, you know, the will was engaged, but it was more about her getting bigger, you know, creating, you know, having more energy, just like you were saying, a little bit more energy, so that whatever it was, her energy was bigger than that. And so then she was, the flow, you know, energetically, she was able to, you know, overcome it in that sense. And I like the analogy, because it's like, you know, if it was like a little rock or a big rock, a boulder, if she just got bigger than the boulder, that somehow, you know, it was so.
If you think about every obstacle that you face in life, and let's say change and the resistance to it is an obstacle, it is always a matter of quality and quantity of energy. If you have quality and quantity of energy, there is no issue. And an obstacle or a change that you don't want is always because in some way it changes the quality or the quantity of your energy. And that's where the energization exercises with the capacity to direct your energy is the solution to just about everything that happens, because then I can, and of course, Kriya, anything where you're able to bring your energy up, that changes the quality. Willpower and divine grace, attunement, give you quantity. If you have quality and quantity of energy, there is no problem. An interesting thing, referring to depression, because one of the questions that I got in advance was about depression. I heard a man talking about it who'd been deeply troubled by depression. And he said the opposite of depression is not happiness. The opposite of depression is vitality. And I've heard this presented in other places now too, because what happens with depression is that you lose the capacity to put out energy. And it's the inability, it's not even that you feel sad, it's the inability to put out energy to do something about it. That actually is where the entrapment begins to happen. Now, of course, and people really literally talk about, it taking an hour and a half to get the energy up to pick up the phone. And of course, we're talking, there's physiological, but everything's karma. So you're brought to that point where you have no vitality. But even if you're not chronically depressed or physiologically inclined toward it, what happens when you get sad? What happens when you get afraid? What happens when you get overwhelmed? It's almost always that you can't do something about it. Or the Swami remarked once about someone, when so-and-so doesn't know what to do, she just does more of it, which amused me. And it was in contrast to who, when I would become afraid, I would stop. I would just stop because I couldn't muster energy until I learned. I've subsequently learned, but that was what would happen. And then therefore the problem would be huge because, and being bigger, as your friend described, another way of thinking of it is when the wave of karma comes, it's a certain size. You just think of it like you're at the ocean. Little waves come, they play around your ankles. It means nothing. And then a wave comes that's up to your nose or over your head. You have a wholly different experience when that wave comes because it's bigger than you. So when a karmic wave hits, it has a certain size. And if relative to you, it's much bigger, then you're overwhelmed by it. That's what the nature of it is. I mean, all this, the pandemic was a big wave. It just overwhelmed all of us. So what happens is, over time, if you think about how a wave goes up the beach, it eventually becomes really small. If you're far enough up the beach, that which was over your head, close to the water line, is finally going to come down and just touch your feet, and it's not going to be a big deal. So any wave, and this is what I was saying earlier about the weird way that time plays with grief. The karma is huge at the beginning, but then if you wait long enough, it gets smaller and smaller. So sometimes what people do is they basically do nothing. They just outlast it. And then they'll think, I got over it. But what you got over was a wave of karma that was smaller than you are now, which means that the next one that comes over is going to just eat you in the same way that the first one did. So what Swamiji was saying is the more you can grow right at the moment, and he uses the phrase meet karma at the crest, the more you can resist the desire to collapse under the weight of it. And that doesn't mean that you're perfect, but anything you do to expand your energy in the face of difficulty is going to help you. Even if because everything is so overwhelming, you suddenly train for a marathon, and you're not even dealing with the issue, but at least you're putting out energy somewhere. It's not always that it's direct, but you're not allowing it to take your vitality. And you're doing what you can. And that's why I say you look at a situation, there's always less and more energy. Even if the energy is deflected a little off to the side, it's better to do what you can do than to do nothing. Because once you get energy going again, then you begin to remember, oh, I'm a person who can put out energy. And then you'll look back, and sometimes the solution will be in front of you.
So
We have a couple questions.
yeah, is our mic on? I didn't see us.
Yes.
Oh, okay. We do have a couple questions in the chat box. One is, can you explain a little bit more about what it means, what it means that we have to own what we want to give away? It means, I'm adding this in there, does it mean we have to break it down, smash it, put it into small pieces until when? When do we know it owns us?
Well, what I mean by that is we have to be self-honest, is actually really what I'm talking about. Owning it means self-honesty, which is, I'm really hurt about this. I had an experience when I was in seclusion of, let's see, I was trying to allow Divine Mother to love me. That was actually what it was. Let me just shift this for a second. I was wanting to allow Divine Mother to love me. And I realized that I had a lot of protection around my heart. That was the way I would put it. It was sort of like I'd been in charge. And then in this meditation, I decided, well, why don't I receive Divine Mother's love? And I in that exercise, the only reason I'm mentioning it is because in that exercise, I realized that my heart was quite protected. And you would think, why would I protect myself against God's love? But I realized it was just a habit, a many incarnations habit of having been hurt, and therefore just being, that's why I said my personality was set up a lot around protecting myself from hurt. So I was not honest with myself. I wasn't willing to really admit how much sadness I carried around inside of me. I wasn't even trying to hide from it. I just didn't know it was there. I didn't see the connection between many of my bad personal qualities and all of that. I was a mystery to myself. That's what I mean by black box. I worked it down in that particular situation. I realized I was carrying, this is all past lives. Some of it was present. Some of it was acting out in the present, but it was syndromes that I could recognize. You know, I have an aggressive personality. Not everybody liked me. I often did things that people didn't like and got in trouble for it. Sometimes people didn't behave well to me. I got it down to, I felt like a lot of people owed me an apology. I don't know. I mean, just like generically, it's like the world should apologize to me. It hasn't treated me right. I didn't really realize the degree to which I was carrying that. There's just sort of this sense of massive misunderstanding from the universe. So that's what I mean by it's a black box. Self-honesty is what I mean by that. That's what it is to own it. You don't have to conquer it. You don't have to get over it yourself. That's where God comes in. But if we're offering the divine, let me see how I can make this. I mean, many of us say, oh, I'll do anything you want, whatever you want, God. But that's not really true. There's a whole lot of things that we're not at all willing to give up. And we need to be self-honest. You know, what are we going to do about this, sir? You know, I would like to give up my desire to be married and have children, but I can't. You know, I would like to not be upset because of the way these people treated me, but I can't. I can't not be upset. I am upset. That's enough. It's when we say, I'm not angry. No, I'm not angry. I've accepted it. It had to happen that way. It's just fine. I'm okay. I'm over it. But we're not. Even on very, very deep levels. That's what I've been really impressed by. Once I was willing to listen to myself, listen to my deeper self, you know, I was just a lot less of a perfect devotee than I thought I was. And that's what I mean by owning it. And that's also then surrender. Surrender's not so hard, because what else are you going to do? It's like, what are we going to do about this? because I can't deal with this when I really admit the degree to which delusion has me. I started this out with Swami, this very early. He put me in charge of the Ananda Publications business. I have no head for business, absolutely none. And he's never ever done anything like that with me again because it was just didn't work. And he kept trying to help me. This was very early. He kept trying to help me. He would give me suggestions. Whatever he said, I would say, yes, sir, I'll do that. Yeah, that sounds great. I'll do that. But the truth was, I was completely confused, utterly helpless, and unable to carry out one of my positive affirmations. I just couldn't do it. But I thought I had to appear to be like all together all the time. I was just so confused. And after about 2 years, I think it went on for 2 years. It seems like that's a long time. Finally, it just reached crisis proportions because Swami just kept piling on the suggestions. I kept saying yes. I kept doing none of them and just became more and more overwrought internally because of the mess. And he was doing it on purpose. And so at one point he said to me, it reached such a point that there was a lot of tension. And he said, you want to appear like a good devotee. And then he said, but you never fooled me, which made me laugh. He always knew how to make me laugh. I just laughed and I said, well, that was the colossal waste of effort, wasn't it? And it was the beginning of a much more honest relationship with myself, with Swami, with God. And that stays in my mind. You never fooled me. You wanted to look like this, cooperative devotee, but you never fooled me. And so the thing is, but I'd been fooling myself was the problem. And so I couldn't pray for help with the actual issues. And that was what I mean by you can't give it to God if you don't own it. If you can't just say, this is who I am, and just stand there. This is who I am. Here's a very important point that, at least to me, means a great deal. If you think about spiritual progress as increasingly refining our vibrations, and if you think of the fact that every single master progressed through all the vibrations from complete delusion to God realization, this is why it's very important to realize this is where the Christians make this terrible mistake in Jesus having just kind of popped out of nowhere and, never having been anything but perfect, just the perfect Son of God. And there he is. He came from nowhere and he's just there because it just completely separates his experience from ours. But when you have Master who says he remembers all the way back to being a diamond and that there was a process by which they became self-realized. Master said he became self-realized a long time ago. But if he was a diamond, and God knows how that works, was he the cut diamond? Was he the uncut diamond? When did the individuality start? I mean, there's a lot of unanswered questions. But that means every vibration of delusion from that level to God realization, his jiva, he himself walked through it, which means there's not a single vibration of delusion that any one of us can go through that Master didn't stand in. That Jesus, that Krishna, they all stood exactly where I'm standing, wanting to look good, but not really being good enough, being terribly angry about something that I shouldn't be angry about, being very sad about something that I shouldn't be sad about. Master stood right there, right exactly there. So he's not going to judge us for it. He's not going to care because he knows you have to go through it to get free. So that to me is like that, really like, what am I hiding then? First of all, of course, we never fool them because they live inside of us. They see inside all the black boxes. They're just waiting for us to be able to say, wow, what are we going to do about this? I mean, that's what surrender is. Surrender is, what are we going to do about this? Because now it's us instead of just me. There's, it's me and God working on it together. And more than that, it's like the problem on the table. It's not just me anymore. It's like, wow, we're caught in this vibration. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to sort this one out and move on? Surrendering it isn't not caring or pretending to be free. It's giving up unique egoic control. That's what it doesn't absolve us of the need to go through anything. And this is where the false idea comes. Oh, goody, I'll just give it to God, and then I won't have to ever actually be honest about myself. It's recognizing that here I am, and what are we going to do about it? Because I can't solve this. It's too big for me. Everything's too big for us, really, except the trivial things. And even actually, everything's too big for us because we're too small. We need God's help in every way. Do you have a question, Supriya?
So staying on this topic just a little bit longer, because there is another question, but a little bit longer. And I want to thank our dear devotee in Houston who wrote that one that I resonate with so much. That it's talking about, how do we own it? Does it mean we have to break it, smash it, cut it into small pieces and everything? Do we have to do that? When I think of those words right there, it's something outside of myself. The relationship, the financial struggle, all this other stuff. But what I'm hearing is this self-honesty that, without deprecating and beating ourselves up, looking at this honestly. I want your comments. I really do. I feel like I'm on the verge of getting something here, that we're looking at our self-study, right? One of the niyamas, I think, self-study, honestly looking at ourselves, that this stuff out there, we don't have to smash it, cut it into small pieces, but rather than that kind of a concept, I can own it by looking at me. How am I responding or reacting to the financial situation or the relationship? What are my attitudes? The world's unfair to me. Hello, this is not right. I don't deserve this. I'm trying to be a good person. All that mental chatter that goes on here, and to look at this. And then what I just heard you say is, number one, I don't have to do this alone. Thank God. I found a path that has 5 great masters and amazing saints and all of this. But the masters and the gurus can help me, not the egoic me, can help my higher self to realize, it goes back to what you said. It's my attitude toward this situation that's happened 3 or 4 times. That I keep magnetizing situations or a person who, that you just see the same patterns. Just look at myself from my higher self with God's grace, so that I can see it, study this. Don't agonize over it. Just look at it honestly, especially after meditation, and then we can see it, and then we can truly own it. Oh, it's my attitude. It gets simpler than feeling like the big monster. Anyway, I think you get what I'm saying.
And also, but bear in mind, we don't have to conquer it. We can just be as awful as we are. That the question was, no, you don't have to parse it apart and conquer it. I remember there was this man in the community who was having a really terrible time, and we all knew it, and Swami knew it, but he wouldn't come to Swami for help because and Swami said this regretfully, because he always feels he can't come to me until he's worked it out. But the fact of the matter is, if he came to Swami and said, I've gotten myself into such a mess, help me. But he wouldn't do that. He had to wait till he'd resolved it, and then And so as a consequence, Swami wasn't able to help him. And as a consequence, it had longer lasting, unfortunate repercussions that might not have happened. So the self-honesty is, you know, I'm not as good as I thought I was. And that's where I remember Swami saying, you never fooled me. I'm not as good as I thought I was. But Master stood here and he made it to God realization. So there's nothing at all wrong with where I'm standing. I just thought I was a bigger, more established tree. And it turns out that I'm just, I'm barely a sprout. And that's hard. That's really hard. But I mean, the word humility, and I'll add the word humiliation to the word humility, global humiliation sometimes. It's like we're trying to fool someone a lot of the time. And we don't have to stand on the street corner and make a big announcement about our limitations. But as Swami said, with God, we must have no secrets. But it's scary. It's really scary to have to say, this is how I feel. I'm very touched by people who are honest like that. This one woman in our community was having a lot of trouble with another devotee. Well, there were two instances like this. One, this man was in a position of influence and he was very difficult to get along with. And this woman wrote to Swami and said, I just am having so much trouble with so-and-so. It's just impossible. Swami said, he just wants to be your friend. And the woman wrote back, friend, I don't even want to be in the same room with him. It was just like no apology, no justification, no effort to make that the right attitude. It's like, sir, this is how I feel. This is what we're going to be working with. On an occasion when it was I myself who said something to Swami, I had to say, sir, you asked me to do this, but I need to be sincere with you. I'm not doing it at all. He didn't even pause. He said, well, so much for theory. Let's deal with reality. And then he made an alternate suggestion, which was within my scope to follow. Because his original suggestion was nice, but I couldn't do it. And it was true. And if I'd been able to do it, probably would have cut a lot of karma off. But I couldn't. Well, so much for theory. Let's work with reality. Just bingo like that. And the other case, another situation between a woman and a man who had influence, and she was having so much trouble with him. She just wrote Swami how awful he was. And Swami says, oh, he just love him. And she said, I don't want to. I don't want to love him. I do not want to expand my heart that much, period. And that was just that. Jyotish's son said to him once in a similar situation when he was about 6, Daddy, I don't want to be that good. It's just, I don't want to be that good. And then you say, what are we going to do about this? Because our commitment to the spiritual path is still there. And that's what surrender means. Surrender means, I don't like this. I don't want it. I can't do it. I don't intend to do it. I refuse. I'm furious. But thy will, not mine, be done. And that's surrender. We think surrender is, oh, Lord, whatever you want, here I am. I am the clay, just mold me into your life. I mean, most of us can't do that. We're just caring too much. And that's what is required, is to bring to the table who you really are and ask God how you're going to work with this. This is what you got, what you're going to do with it. Because there's always a way to go forward. From wherever you're standing, there's always a forward direction. And if we see what happens, and this happens in our own minds, this happens even with the intuitions we get, we ask for advice about, for example, how to totally forgive this person, help me to forgive this person who betrayed me. So we keep asking for guidance in how to forgive a person who betrayed us. And we offer it and we offer it and it never comes. Because the question is not how to forgive them. The question is how to stop fantasizing about killing them. It's like we haven't risen to the level of forgiveness. We just have to make sure that we don't murder them so that we won't end up having our life be in prison. Or the question might be, how can I get away from this situation? I cannot deal with this. You have got to give me a way to get away from it. And the prayer is, help me to get away from this because I can't deal with it. And we keep asking for to pray for forgiveness. We're so far from forgiveness. We don't even want to forgive them. We don't want to forgive them. We want to stay angry. So now we have to say, given how angry I am, can you please show me a way to avoid having to face this every day or whatever it might be? That's what you surrender. It's just like this, because if we don't know ourselves, and this is what people do, we pray, and we pray for something that is not relevant. We're trying to work out somebody else's karma because we like it better and it makes us look good. This was my very early experience. I kept asking God what he wanted me to do, and I couldn't get an answer. I put this in my book. You've heard me say it many times, but I kept praying and I couldn't get an answer. And I was praying so sincerely and I couldn't get an answer. And when I was sobbing in front of Swami saying that, it's so hard to know God's will. That was when I said that, and très dramatic, like sobbing with my head down. He said, no, it's not. No, it's not hard to know God's will. He said it about like that, like, what are we having for lunch? And no, it's not hard to know God's will. I'm just in this Italian opera of the devotee's drama. And then he basically said nothing else to me. And I was pretty darn mad. I was suffering and he seemed essentially indifferent. And I kept, what I did with my thoughts for a few minutes, walking from his house back to my trailer, was, well, it's easy for him to know God's will. He was a direct disciple of Master. He's been doing Kriya all this time, blah, blah, blah. By the time I got to my trailer, I realized that Swami did not say it's easy for him to know God's will. He said it's easy to know God's will. A very different statement. So because I try to be truthful, and I remembered that I was changing what he said. I was changing what he said to suit my prejudices. But fortunately, I'm a wordsmith, and the words came in. And I sat to meditate, and I said, well, it's very hard for me to know God's will. Why is it so hard for me to know God's will? And my inner voice, I feel like it was a conversation with Swami, but the voice said, because you don't want to know. I got very defensive at that, super defensive. Yes, I do. I'm trying so hard. And then the voice said again, no, you don't want to know because you're afraid to know. And that was when I said, oh. And the issue was, and it was perfectly clear cut as soon as I thought about it, which is God's will was perfectly obvious. I just didn't like it. I super didn't like it. This is, here we are with change. I super didn't like it. So I kept trying to offer God my tremendous interest in what he wanted. But I was offering something that I didn't own that. I didn't own surrender to his will. The only thing I owned was my deep attachment to a certain outcome. And when I finally just presented to God my deep attachment to a certain outcome and said, what are we going to do about this? Then I was offering him the right thing. And what he basically said was, we're going to suffer. That's what's going to happen because you're not going to get what you want. But I'll help you. So, I mean, that's a very important chain to follow, and I hope that does help.
So I want to relay something to you. This came to me privately, but the person says, I meant for this to be a question to Asha. So It happened to come to me privately. So I'm going to read it because what you just said to me is very much right here. The person says, I recently asked myself the question of why I so resist what is and the changes in people's attitudes and behaviors. The response I got was that I was afraid to grow. Does that make sense to you?
That's precisely it. I mean, Supriya, that question is the entire class. The only certainty in life is that nothing on the material plane when we're identified with our material selves and our egoic self identified with the material world, which is who we are, is that nothing will ever stay the same, period. And every minute we have a choice, which is we either recognize that I have to increase my awareness and expand my capacities. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about quality and quantity of energy, that more will be asked of me. It always comes down to quality and quantity of energy. And one of the three major delusions of Maya is intoxicants. And, wine, money, and women is how it's produced, if it's patriarchal, the way it's presented. But sex, wine, and money is how you would say it. But wine is an intoxicant. So what does wine do? What wine does is it dulls our perception. And when our perceptions are dulled, whatever has been bothering us doesn't bother us as much because we don't feel anything as acutely. So it's a major element of Maya. So there's, when you're dealing with this, you're right in the middle of the story. You're not on the edge. And the middle of the story is, I don't want to grow, which is to say, I don't want to expand my awareness. I want to feel better by dulling my awareness, because that's what happens if we refuse to grow, is that we become duller, because you're not going to stay the same. We're all heading toward death. We're all heading toward old age and death, and everything wears out. You can't just freeze it. If you're not trying to grow, by definition, you're going backwards. And this is an illusion, because we think that we will feel better by lowering our awareness. This is what an intoxicant does. It lowers our awareness. And you don't have to have a substance problem, but wine, that's why they say wine, because it explains it. It can just be, I prefer not to put out as much energy. I'll watch television, I'll sit on Netflix, I'll eat ice cream, I'll keep a heavy diet, I won't energize, I won't exercise. I'll just do whatever it is that allows us to be a little duller, and thinking that duller is better. So yeah, the growth means expanding our awareness. Growth means improving the quality and the quantity of our energy. And awareness means self-honesty. Awareness means the awareness of the actual nature of life. And Maitri brings it up as primordial grief. I bring it up as accumulated heartbreak. I can bring it up as just, I don't want to do it. I'm sorry, sir. I just don't want to do it. It's just too bloody much work and I don't want to do it. Is there somebody else I can talk to who can just give me an easier route? and Master doesn't care if we just sit there. We can sit here for 100 lifetimes. 100 lifetimes is nothing compared to eternity. And if that's the route we want to take, if we want to just keep refusing to grow and therefore continually shrinking, we're allowed to do that. And then what that is that just puts a cap on our capacity to experience happiness. And who suffers? God doesn't suffer, we suffer. But when the suffering of remaining as we are is greater than the effort required to change, and that's when you reach that tipping point, and when you begin to reach that tipping point at all, it gradually accelerates to the point where you can't quit. You're just not able to quit. And that's Swami. What's the secret of the spiritual path is it's a matter of life or death. I have no choice. Yeah, and fear of growing. So then you ask, what am I afraid of? I don't want to be that good. If I start loving people like that, more people will want me to love them. If I start serving like that, more people will want me to serve. If I start showing people what I really feel, not everybody's going to respect me. If I really risk it, what if I fail? If I actually admit even to God what my shortcomings are, I'll be so humiliated and embarrassed I won't be able to go forward. So the exercise, I would suggest both journaling And meditation is, why am I afraid to grow? You have to go backwards. What does growing mean to me? Why is it fearful? What's so great about where I am? One of the pop culture people put it perfectly. He said, if you defend your limitations, the prize is you get to keep them. Which I thought was just perfect. You don't go to hell forever. You just get to be limited. If you insist on being limited, guess what? You get to be limited. So I often ask myself, is this the apex of happiness that I can imagine? Or is there a possibility that there's more? So why am I staking out this turf and building a blockade around it? Like, is this really such a great thing to defend?
I mean, because I think she. So we do have a few more questions, a couple more questions. Do you want to take one more and then we have a little break?
Yeah, let's do one more and then we'll take a break.
It says, how can one cope with changes that are difficult in oneself and at the same time cope with the changes that loved ones around us are also going through hard times? How can we find the balance?
Quantity and quality of energy, but let's be more realistic about it. Part of self-honesty is to recognize the limits of our capacity to influence anyone and everything. This is the biggest kind of surrender. Lord, I can't take care of all these people. Their destiny is not in my hands. I can witness for them, I can try to help, but they're just realistic limits to how much I can do. The degree to which other people are in charge of their own destiny is a very important thing to remember. And a little bit of a perspective is helpful about how many incarnations we've had and what a brief moment this one is. Even the mother of a child or the spouse, it's like everybody is alone before God and has their own destiny. So that's just part of it. But the other part is we are all equally important. Some people think to be spiritual means to sacrifice ourselves beyond what is reasonable. That's not true, because to sacrifice yourself is not to see things as they truly are, which is everybody in your world, for example, is equally loved by God and is equally important. And the people that you love are not more loved by God than you are. And when you say, well, I'm the one who's going to give up everything and suffer and be terrible, that's not actually truth. And therefore, it won't bring you what you think it will. And this is what happens a lot of times, is people sacrifice more than they ought to sacrifice, thinking it will help, but it usually doesn't help because it's not truthful. It's a compulsive action because I believe that I am in charge of everyone's destiny. So what we have to be is we have to be impersonal, and that means ourselves. There's 5 of you around the table, and everybody should give as much as they're able to give within a realistic, self-honest idea of what I can do with good energy. That is not being compelled because of my guilt and my fear, but is actually being called from me because it's appropriate. And so that is a huge sadhana, just a tremendous, gigantic lifetime sadhana, to be able to say what is appropriate. And, it's not just what's theoretically possible, but what's appropriate. Now, a master has no self. And so therefore there's nothing, he's not compelled in any way, but even he or she, they won't give more than is appropriate. Because you don't help people. I mean, we have a word for it, it's called enabling. But you don't help people by moving outside of Dharma. And I am part of that equation. When Swamiji said to us as community leaders, it's presumptuous not to take yourself into account, is how he put it. It's presumptuous to say that I have no needs, no limitations, no necessities of my own. That's a presumption. I mean, presumptuous in the sense that it's arrogant. It's like, I just can't do this. I can only do so much. Now, that's part of that question. So there's 5 of you, and everybody does what they can do, but nobody should cross the lines of Dharma and just support when support is not appropriate. But it takes, now this is then what you have to surrender. You have to surrender your broken heart and say to Divine Mother, it breaks my heart to see so-and-so having to go through this, but why would it not be your will that they go through it? When my parents became ill at the end of their lives in various ways, because I have a lot of willpower, they live in Los Angeles. I rushed down to Los Angeles and started taking over their lives, thinking that I would make everything work for them. Oddly enough, they didn't appreciate it. And, I couldn't figure out for a while why they didn't appreciate it. But then a very interesting thought came to me. It went like this, that at that point in my life, I was not afraid of my own karma. If something happened to me, I knew it was my karma and I would accept it. But I was really afraid that for my parents, that they would have to face their karma. And I realized that the underlying motivation behind that was profound disrespect for them. Because I can face my karma, but you're much too weak to face yours. I have to rush in and make your life work for you. You're not capable of standing up and facing your own life. I'm gonna go between you and your destiny and pad it all over the place. And my parents could feel that. They could feel a profound disrespect. And they really didn't appreciate it. And then I realized that what they were going through was exactly what they had to go through. It was perfect for them. And I began to try to help them face it rather than come in between and prevent it from happening. And that was a huge shift, not only in our relationship, my relationship with them, but really in my relationship with the whole world. Because I realized the tremendous, because I have a lot of energy and a lot of willpower, and sometimes I can see solutions. And I was always rushing into people's lives because I was afraid they couldn't handle their own karma. And they didn't like it. They would turn on me. And I would be so confused because after all, I mean so well, that they sensed the essential disrespect that I was presenting to them. So if God is taking care of me, why is God not also taking care of someone else? And this is where this weird kind of egotism gets in there, where it's masking as all this self-sacrificing humility, but it's really egotism. And that's where, again, we're offering God the wrong things. We think that we're offering him, oh, please help these people. But really, we're holding on to an egoic thought because we're not honest enough to know what we're doing. And one of the ways we can tell is when it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, that's a clue, isn't it? And if we feel miserable instead of overjoyed, that's a clue also. I think there was more to that question, but I may have lost the thread. So why don't we take a chanting break? And then we'll come back. And if there's more to that question that I didn't touch, we can go to it then. How's that?
So the the question is, how do you release yourself from thought patterns that no longer serve you?
Well, the first thing I would say is they must be serving you, or else you wouldn't be doing them. I mean, it's the phrase of the question, which is one part of you knows that they're not serving you, but obviously another part of you thinks they are, otherwise you wouldn't be doing them. And what you're saying is, this is a harmful thought pattern. And but why am I still committed to it? I mean, this is sort of what I was saying a little while ago. The effort to change has to appear less awful than the suffering of continuing the way we are. The other reason that we continue to do things is because there's just a lot of momentum. It's just a long-standing habit. You're going 100 miles an hour. You may realize that you want to turn right, but you've sailed past the exit. And you have to do all the things that are required to slow down the automobile, make a U-turn, find your way back. So momentum is a huge part of why we can continue doing things even after we know that we shouldn't do them. So one suggestion I would make is that almost every major issue in our lives has many, many smaller tendrils. I'll use this as an example. A woman came to me and she was very angry with her mother. And when I asked her if she was genuinely an angry person, she said, no, she wasn't. She was just angry at her mother. But as we talked about things, it became obvious to me that she had an inclination to flash out in irritation over many small issues. And it was impossible for her to approach the issue of her anger against her mother. It was just too big. And there were too many tendrils and too many subconscious threads. But what did that attitude fundamentally represent? And where could she attack it where it was easier to have a victory? And so she started working, just with the inclination to feel anger, to feel resentment and annoyance when a driver cut her off on the freeway, when a coworker didn't wash his coffee cups, when the post office was closing for the holiday and she didn't remember it. In every case, there was the same flash. And she started disciplining the flash there. And I didn't keep up with her. But if you have a fundamental thought pattern, there's several things that you can do. One is to ask yourself, where else does it manifest? And where does it manifest where it's a little smaller than I am? So that we can get out of the habit. You start nibbling it away from the edges. The other is to realize that if you really want to get over it, it needs to become a life or death emergency every single time the thought arises. A friend of mine who had a negative thought pattern, I said, find an affirmation that's the opposite of it, and don't indulge that thought even for a split second. Swamiji says part of the way that Satan influences us is he persuades us that we have to relate to him. And then all of a sudden we're engaged. Whereas you don't have to relate to him. You don't have to relate to that thought. You just have to say, get out. And one of the ways, but nature abhors a vacuum. You can't just create nothing. So you need a chant, you need an affirmation, whatever it might be that you can, and it should be simple and it should be accessible. And every single time that thought starts coming into your head in any form, if you're alone, I would stand up and march in place and say out loud whatever it is the antidote is. And if you're not able to do it in a really big physical and vocal way, then scream it into your own mind. In other words, you have to make an absolute commitment to getting rid of it. And if you find that you're not able to do that, then it's not quite time to get rid of it. And you need to try to develop quality and quantity of energy in other ways. But you need to be serious. Like whatever the thought form is, you may need to purge yourself of every reminder of everything. If you're very angry with some person or something like that, you need to take out of your environment every single thing that reminds you of that person. Or if it's but the other things are everything else I've been saying. What am I afraid of?
You can go get some.
Why do I keep doing this? What am I afraid of? Why do I cling to this instead of taking another alternative? There's going to be a reason. Because when you're done with it, it goes away. And there's obviously all the others, Kriya and devotion and so on, but specifically because I'm talking in a certain way, that's what I would say. What is the antidote to it? And the other side is, what is the antidote? What is the opposite of this attitude? And if it's, that nobody loves me, well, then why don't I start loving other people? Or if it's anger, it becomes acceptance. If it's grief, I need to sing joy, 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 ever new joy, whatever it might be. What is the opposite of it? And try to add as much as you try to take out as much as you can, any indulgence in it, and you try to add into your life as much as you can the opposite of it. And it's a long path. And we have built up a lot of karma in a certain way, in a certain inclination, and we're going to have to put out as much energy in the opposite direction as we put out to build this one, and there's no shortcut. And we're not able to generate that energy all at once. So we have to do it today and tomorrow with an endless stream of tomorrows in front of us. But there's a certainty that delusion is finite and bliss is infinite. So we will reach the end of it. And every single time that you fail is just one less time that you will fail, because failure is finite. So each time that you collapse again, consider, great, I just crossed one more off the list. And I do find that comforting. As long as I don't quit, success is certain. The only way I can fail is to stop putting out effort. And then I don't fail, I just pause. I just postpone my victory.
So we don't have any more questions right at the moment. Folks that are on, if you would like to ask a question, that would be wonderful. Maybe Mike, did you come on because you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Asha Nayaswami, first of all, thank you for being here. And thank you, Ananda Dallas. I just wanted to ask, how much can all of this be made easier by our meditation, Kriya Yoga, and listening, intuiting? That's my question.
I mean, these are the tools. In Kriya Yoga, I mean, all that we're talking about is we're talking about vrittis in the spine. And Kriya Yoga is the method par excellence for dissolving those vrittis. So basically, my way of suggesting is we hit it on all fronts. And everybody has different temperament. And I have an inclination toward clarity of mind. That's what I really like, clarity of mind. I operate much better if I'm clear in my mind what it is that I'm trying to do. And so this is what I particularly offer, more than I offer other things. I just offer this, trying to clarify it so that we'll know which way is forward. But of course, sadhana, devotion, energization, every little thing that you can do. I just always throw the kitchen sink at it, whatever it might be. I'm a karma yogi primarily by temperament, and therefore action always helps me. Service, doing something. When COVID struck, I realized I didn't quite have enough clarity of mind to take seclusion or start writing a book or something like that. So I started sewing face masks, cotton face masks. I probably sewn about 500 of them by now, just because, it was a tough situation and I had to do something. And I sort of randomly was drawn into that one. And I still have a pile of them going downstairs. I keep giving them away. I've just given hundreds of them away by now. But it eases my anxiety, my concern, my sense of confinement, all the different problems that I have. Action works for me. And if I couldn't sew face masks, I'd probably be baking bread or making cookies, or meaning you just find the antidote, whatever the antidote is. And if Kriya is you're capable of just sitting down and doing more and more Kriyas, by all means do them. And if by all means do some Kriyas, because it will help enormously. But this is the art, as opposed to the science of the spiritual path. The art is to figure out, of all, Master said you have to do 1% of what he taught, but everybody's going to take a different 1%. That's why he had to teach so much. And that's the art of it, of the many choices, all of which are effective. Which one is going to work for me right now, in this moment, at this time? That's what keeps us going. I had, Maitri, I had two questions that you sent me in advance, and I want to at least touch them because they were from somebody. One of them was, how to deal with regret. When Swamiji and I were talking about reincarnation, he said what draws us to reincarnate is longing and regret. And so it's basically those are the hooks. So the idea, regret is an extremely powerful karmic force. What I would suggest is this: regret usually relates to a particular situation. If only I could have gotten there in time. I didn't have the nerve to speak up. I let my emotions run away with me, and I said things I shouldn't have said. It always has a context. Regret is based on context. So the antidote to regret is to understand what principle was violated and to conscientiously do your best never to violate that principle again. And then the second thing to bear in mind is everybody's in charge of their own destiny. And it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't necessary for it to happen. And that doesn't mean it was good. It just means that there were necessary lessons for everyone involved, including you. But the best, and you can always pray, and this is another question that comes, how to deal with how is it phrased? Unresolved issues with people who are now off the planet that you can't deal with in person. Being off the planet means nothing in terms of your unresolved issues. I wish it did. I mean, it would be really nice if death just ended things. Death does nothing. It's just like somebody walks behind a screen. So on one hand, it's an unresolved issue. Yeah, you're going to have to resolve it. But death doesn't change that. It just means you're going to have to resolve it. And you can be absolutely certain that you'll get a chance to. But it's the same question. What is the basic principle or basic attitude that is behind this unresolved issue? Because we don't have to resolve it with the person with whom we have acted it out. It's an energy within yourself that has to be resolved. And you can resolve it with a stand-in and get free. So what is the principle that I'm regretting and worrying about? How can I make that into something that I can be exceedingly conscientious about not doing again? And what that does is it not only clears the karma, but your actual shift of consciousness will automatically reach the person wherever they are in the cosmos, because the energy hook between you is being resolved, and that will reach them as harmony. You may also project it as harmony. There's no harm because they will receive it. But mainly what we're talking about is how to resolve the karma. You resolve the karma on the vibrational level. The details are not the karma. The karma is the vibration of consciousness. Shift the vibration of consciousness and everything will work out. And if it's a real close association, as I say, you can pray for them, but you don't even have to, because your connectedness through the ether, we're a solar system with the people that we're connected to. So any shift in the orbit of any person in that solar system will shift everybody's orbit, because that's the way it works. And ultimately you can extricate yourself if that's what you're looking for. And then they will have to deal with someone else, but you'll be done. Okay, so I just wanted to answer both of those. So what were you going to say, my two?
I think well, Eric was on a minute ago and he acted like he maybe had a question. Eric, are you still there, and is this a good time?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'll be quiet. It was fascinating. I know we live in a different time because the seminar, started a couple of hours ago, and in that time I've driven about 100 miles, measured a couple of houses, listened to this on the car, listened to this on my phone, and now I'm at home. So it's interesting. But I was thinking about what you were saying about, and my phone looks like it may die. So let me move over here and plug it in. But I was thinking when you said about trying to change those aspects of us that come up that are so hard to really stomach some days. And you were saying, talking about not relating to them or kind of giving them the time of day, so to speak. And I understand that. What I found beyond affirming never really quite worked out well for me.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've seen is that those aspects, I no longer push them away. And I think that's one of the important things, is that it can come up in the middle of something and we just want to do the opposite in some sense. But I have found if I kind of look at that as an aspect of God and I just introduce it, so to speak, kind of pull it out of the ether and just say, God, look at this. And I am relating to it in that I'm holding it in presence, but I'm not saying that that's who I am. It's kind of like, I think the grace of God sometimes is the only thing that can dissolve something. So my part in it is bringing it up, letting it sit there beside me and kind of introducing it to God, but letting God actually do the work on it.
Well, see, what you're describing to me is what I was saying earlier, which is the necessity for self-honesty.
Yes.
And the necessity not to be afraid when this thing comes.
Yes.
And what you say is precisely a precise, exact description of what I was suggesting.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I just didn't hear it well then.
No,
because I was thinking more affirming the opposite.
No, but let me
yeah. Go ahead.
Because the next question was, why do I persist in these thoughts? And so that I was taking that from a different angle.
Okay.
If I just have a tape that I'm just sick of that runs in my mind, how do I stop the tape?
Okay.
And for speaking for myself, I had a kind of generic anxiety that I wouldn't be able to deal with things. Just had a lot of responsibility, and I would have this generic anxiety that would just come over me. And I found the affirmation, I know God's power is limitless, and as I am made in his image, I too have the strength to overcome all obstacles.
Wow.
Now, and so I wasn't saying, I'm not afraid, I'm not anxious, because I wasn't denying what I felt. I wasn't affirming the opposite, which is very important, because sometimes people use affirmations wrongly.
Yes.
I feel terribly afraid. So what I say is, I'm not afraid, I'm not afraid, I'm not afraid. And the more you say it, the more afraid you are. Because the subconscious mind is saying, you idiot, you're scared, you're terrified. I don't believe you for a minute.
Yeah.
So you have to get an affirmation that you actually can believe. And so I'll break this down. I know God's power is limitless. Okay, I actually do know God's power is limitless. I know that. I don't deny it. And as I am made in his image, well, I'm a little less certain about that, but more of me believes that than doesn't believe it. So now I've moved out of my subconscious mind can get a toehold there, but not more, because I know I'm made in his image. I too have the strength. And this is where I'm really in the dicey zone. But this is the third line that started with, I know God's power is limitless. So I'm pushing myself, but I'm not pushing myself farther than I can go.
Makes sense.
I have the strength to overcome all obstacles. So it's like a 50-50 chance that I can do it. Right? And that's the right size affirmation. And that's the right affirmation. Because the more I say it, the more it begins to really feel true to me. And it can, when I'm just because I actually don't have, it really worked. I mean, I did this for years and I still do it. But when the generic opposite, which is just this sort of energy comes, I say, I know God's power is limitless. And as I am made in his image, I do have the strength to overcome all obstacles.
That's beautiful.
I could fill the headspace that would otherwise would run the wrong tape. So I would substitute a better tape for the bad one, but it was one I could believe.
And yet, when I listen to you, what I hear is sometimes there is a way that an affirmation plays that it is the presence of God. It is an aspect of God that's present. And it helps me to hold it as God being present, as kind of like that grace which can overcome all things, rather than thinking it as kind of a hard and fast opposite. Does that make sense to you?
No, that's exactly right. Everything is directional. We're
Yeah.
trying to get out of a bad place. And of course, the musical chants, are just, if a musical chant, there's been times in my life when I just had certain chants, and when my repeating emotional or whatever the issues were, when I would be trying to extricate myself from something difficult, and the repeating tape, the thoughts that don't serve me, which was the form of the question, I would sing, whatever chant felt to me like that I could connect with, that would carry me where I needed to go. Because it's all vibrational. It's all level of consciousness. You're just on this level of consciousness. If you move to this one, this isn't real anymore. So you have to just figure out how to extricate. And if you're here, sometimes here doesn't work. This is why I was saying when Mike asked that, sit down and do a few kriyas. If you're not too upset to do a few kriyas.
Yeah.
And if you can really do kriyas and really change your consciousness, yes, do that. But if you sit down to do the kriyas and your tape just gets louder and louder, then you may need to move to your harmonium or move to walking vigorously and repeating your affirmation, whatever it might be. It's the art. You have to figure it out. But I completely agree.
It makes sense.
You can't just repudiate your thought and insist on the opposite. That is 100% of what I was trying to say about the black box. You can't just, you can't pretend that this is not me by affirming that I'm something else. I have observed that doesn't work. Affirmations are more subtle than that.
That's exactly it is. And I find something as subtle as you can't try to chase something out of the room with an affirmation. I actually myself have to be comfortable with the uncomfortableness of that aspect staying while I say this thing. Now, I don't interact with it like my friend and, give it that and that, but I keep it in the same room. I have to give it that respect as some aspect of God, that is quite unpleasant. But, yeah.
When I say interact with it, what I mean by that is, maybe I'm really justified in the way I feel because of the people who did this. That's what I mean. You dive into it and all of a sudden you're
and that's not interacting with it. It's kind of creating some idea scenario that keeps it in place in some sense.
And the other part of it is, wait. Just like I lost it for a second. I've lost the thought. If it comes back, I'll offer it. But it's.
I appreciate that.
Okay.
Good talking with you.
Okay, great. Very good, Eric. Very good point and very important clarification. I'm really super glad you asked that. That was a good question.
Thank you.
I mean, all these thoughts are subtle and they all sort of weave together, and you have to really sort of figure out what you're working with.
It's a grand experiment, that we all, and when we share like this, it makes a huge difference because it takes subtle things to a deeper level and important. Yeah.
And, the question was raised earlier before also about, when COVID first started, or when, I don't know how, well, I guess you had to give up your physical center. You're like us, we haven't been together in one place. I heard myself a couple of weeks ago, just like a toddler saying, I want our church to open. Just like that. I'm so deprived. Actually, I think in about a week, we get to bring like 20 people in or something. It's beginning to shift. But, at the beginning, we all really rushed together online. We were meditating together, we're doing yoga together, we're chanting together. I feel like, I certainly know it has been true to some extent. It's like we thought it was a short-term emergency. This is what I was saying at the beginning. But this being a longer-term thing where we don't get to go back together, where we don't get our old way of life back so quickly, I think we all have to really think about what we need to sustain ourselves in the long run here. I certainly think that we get depressed, we get low energy, and we don't associate the fact that we're not coming together as often, we're not meditating together as often, with the fact that I don't feel like meditating together as often. We don't realize that it's once we let the energy drop, then we don't feel like putting out the energy again. Because if we could have come together like we normally would, we would all just be automatically renewed by that rhythm. So it's just really important to really pay attention. I don't know how much longer this will go on. However long it goes on before we can resume a more natural rhythm of relating, I think we have to just make sure that we're bringing enough energy into our lives. That's how I call it. I mean, it's one of the reasons people ask me why, when I would teach meditation one, the beginning meditation class, I would say to people, you know, you're certain right now that you'll never stop meditating, but let me tell you why you'll quit. And one of the reasons that people quit is because they stop bringing fresh energy into their lives. They just sort of get to a certain point, and then it doesn't seem as important to come to Sunday service, to meditate with other people, to chant. I mean, it's a lot of it is group energy, but they don't feed themselves. And once you stop feeding yourself, your energy drops and you don't remember why you should. And then you find yourself 5 years later and you don't remember what happened. I mean, I don't think that's who I'm talking to, but it's always a danger. I've been saved from it because my responsibility has always been to share the teaching. So I've not been allowed, I've been protected from falling into that. But if it's not automatic, you have to make sure that there's some repeating pattern of rejuvenation in your life, whatever it might be.
So, Sam and Pam, our dear friends from Ananda, Monterey Bay, have joined us today. And is there anybody else from your group on? I don't know if I know all the names.
Beverly's here.
Oh, Beverly. Yeah, Beverly. Okay. Anyway, we really enjoy our satsang with these folks. And you guys have a question, so go for it.
I don't know if it's a question as much as I'll just talk. It's probably more of a statement. I never am sure what all is going to come out. But it's just evidently it's been my characteristic to absorb things that are very important, like spiritual studies and rules and regulations, to absorb them as much as I can, internalize them, and then attempt to perfect my own expression, which is of course impossible. But today, more than any other time perhaps, I've felt a sense of release or relief, at least for the short time, that you've been talking about being human. And it's okay not to always meet these impossible standards. I've been living my life trying to meet an impossible standard. And that's difficult.
Yeah.
And it's really nice. It's nice to have heard that it might be okay not to do that.
You know, I want to even put a sharper point on it, Pam, because you and me both, sister, is what I'll say. I mean, I really get what you're saying, because it's not merely that it's an impossible standard. It's missing the point of the spiritual path. It's a fundamental, but so common that there's no reason to feel uncomfortable. It's just one of the most common ways that we misinterpret the path. And I put it like this. I have 2 apple trees outside. Sometimes I eat the apples. Again, if you've listened to me, you've heard me say this, but it's exactly what's happening now. An apple seed can become an apple tree, and it's guaranteed it will be an apple tree. It has the potential. But it has to go through every single stage between seed and tree before it can become a tree. And no amount of impatience or judgment or yelling at it will have any effect. It's just not gonna look like an apple tree for a really, really, really long time. But it's not failing in its destiny to become an apple tree. It's just the only way to get there. And a lot of us, because of our perfectionist nature, God knows what it is, and the positive side of that is that we're zealous. You know, we want to do a good thing, but we misunderstand how to do a good thing. And it's actually, once that little thing shifts, which is not a little thing. I just like, here I am, I'm just a sapling. What do you expect of a sapling? Sapling just cannot produce apples, and so it's fine. I just can't make apples. I just have to be here and be a sapling.
But I need to have the farmer, or perhaps you, in my pocket for all those times that my mind is telling me the wrong thing, where I just need to be nudged back on the right way of thinking. Again, it's attitude, whatever it is, but I can go off in my own little directions, how I interpret these things and how I've seen other people interpret them, and as I'm reading someone else's experience, which may not be mine, probably not. So I need to have a master's voice. I've asked him so many times to yell because I often don't hear what I'm with the right answer. So I need you or someone lovely else in my pocket for a while to help me when I'm starting to kind of go the wrong direction, to bring me back. I wondered if you're available.
One of my favorite whispers, and I wish I could tell you where it is, but it talks about how God lives in the hero, the moth, and me. And it's just, and I love that, because God lives in the hero and God lives in the moth. And then I come after the moth. And it just, what I was trying to say is, if you had an image that every time you begin to think you ought to be something other than you are, if you can I'm just the moth, and Master's in the moth, and that's just where I live. I'm looking for an antidote. But yes, and look, but Pam, look, we have each other.
And sometimes I feel, because of where we are physically, even when there's no COVID, I guess just the wonderful experience of being in community. I love having the freedom of being out on our own thing, but I also really, really miss bumping into someone else on the sidewalk and saying, I had a dream last night. I mean, something like that. I don't know, maybe next lifetime, if not this one. Just really, really want to get this right. I want to figure it out and be happy. So thank you for what you bring to us. I deeply, deeply am very grateful. And for all of these lovely people in Dallas. It's just, in Texas. It's great.
This is the positive side of what we've lost and what we've been given. This global friendships this active global friendship, we had it, but not like this. So we've lost a lot and we've gained a lot. It's been a fascinating, God always knows what he's doing. I don't always agree with him, but that's just my opinion. Here we are. Pam, I wanted to tell you something which is funny. Many years ago, like in the 70s, when Yoga Journal was the vehicle through which we all talked to each other. I don't know, it might still be there, but it was the only thing then. There was an article which was called The Dark Side of Meditation. And it was such a weird title. I remember the article, actually kept it for decades. And basically, this is what it said. Type A people, which is that phrase still used, aggressive perfectionist people, often take up meditation because they're so hyper and they're so tense, they need it to relax. Then they start meditation and they find out that not only do I have to meditate, but I have to be perfect in it. And then it becomes the biggest stressor of all. Yeah, moi, exactly. So at first, when I first saw that article, I thought this is a joke. I thought it was just something weird, but it's very, very true. What could be worse than absolute perfection in terms of I can always fail. I get to fail all the time. Yeah. But
I never know when not trying hard enough means I'm sliding into indifference or laziness. There's that fine line between, well, if I don't try so hard, maybe I'm not supposed to try so hard, but if I don't try so hard, then I won't try so hard. It's it's one of these can't win kinds of things.
So. Me works for me.
I'm sorry?
That's why the moth and me works for me. But let me get this. I have been criticized. I mean, I occasionally get emails when I say this, but I have no expectation of being liberated in this lifetime. Absolutely none. When I take my life breath, if God wants to surprise me, I'll accept the surprise. But there's just no expectation of that. And I don't think it's next lifetime or the next or the next or anything like that. It's like, I don't know. It's just like I can't do better than I'm doing. And the stress of trying to do better than I'm doing makes even what I'm doing terrible. So I figure, and I think it's an honest figuring, and I think everybody who's listening to this can take it. We're doing real well. We're just like doing great compared to where we've been, compared to where we could be. And if we're not, if we're not in the last lap, or at least rounding the far turn, and it's just going to take a little while. And I can live with that, because that's much easier to live with than the constant anxiety of not living up to it.
I totally agree with you, unless I'm in a depression, and then I have the total opposite. So yeah, that's why it'd be nice to bump out of that and be done with that. That's for sure. So I also identify with Maitreyi's question. So
well, I think your sincerity is everything. Sincerity is everything. Your success is less important than your sincerity. Meaning that you're absolutely sincere in what you're doing. You're authentic in your commitment. And then after that, it's all in God's hands. We just don't know. We don't know how far the nail is in the wall. That's really the issue. That's the main problem. We just don't know how far it is. So we're just sincerely trying to pull it out. And,
all right.
I have a question.
You have okay. Yeah. I was going to say we're getting close here.
We're getting
so
close, but
if you have any other questions, make sure you either raise your hand or whatever. But my husband will let him talk now.
Oh, thank you, dear. If we could revisit your story about you and your parents and you trying to save them from their karma and finding out that you had to find somewhere that point where you're neither trying to save them from their karma or just ignoring them. There's a medium point there somewhere where you're letting them learn the lessons they need to learn. That's something that comes up often for us as parents. And I'm wondering how you dealt with that question, how you find that point where they are able to go through the karma they need to, but where do you draw the line?
First, I have to say I'm not a parent. Dealing with my parents was much easier than would be, I can imagine, if I were a parent. So first, my heart goes out to you. I think the desire to protect and facilitate your child's life must be almost irresistible, is all I would say.
Yeah.
I think that there has to be, I would respectfully suggest, there has to be a constant effort to see your child not as your child, but as a divine soul on a journey who's sharing part of it with you. Master actually said somewhere that once your children reach a certain age, you should forget that they were ever your children. You should treat them as friends, adult friends in your life. Now, your son is somewhere in between, so he's not quite. How old is he now?
He's 17.
He's a senior.
He's a senior. But if I were a parent, this is what I would try to do. I would constantly remember that he's not 17, that he's as old as God, and that he's had countless incarnations and he's been through countless cycles. And whatever's happening now is just a tiny blip on the radar screen that Divine Mother has been kind enough to allow you to share. And that he is perfectly capable of being himself. And whenever there is an actual opening or real opportunity for you to step in and advise, I would try to make it as much as possible superconscious to superconscious instead of parent to child. I remember being 10. Now, of course, I was a particularly self-aware child, and knowing that my parents actually had no influence over me and that they could move me around and do things, but I was my own person. And when somebody's 17, they really are. My friend, this is just an amusing side, but she when her son was about 15 or 16, she said, he wants to go to the beach. They're going to have this big sleep out and it's going to be all girls and boys together. She said, I just don't quite know what to say. So we're just talking. She comes back the next day. My son has organized the whole trip. He's the one who planned it. So it was like, we have to think about it a little differently. Now, here's another one from her, actually. She was a single mom of a boy. And for much of his childhood, she used to actually do affirmations for him. She would visualize him and she would like speak, the affirmation to have him be a spiritual person or whatever it was. And when he was about 13 or 14, their relationship suddenly got extremely disharmonious. He became just angry with her all the time. And intuitively, she realized that he felt her trying to force him in a certain direction. And she stopped doing those affirmations. And instead, she would pray, Divine Mother, he's your child. He's always been your child. Tell me what you want me to do. And she said almost immediately, when she stopped trying to force him, he started being receptive and harmonious again. Now, I'm not a parent, and I know it doesn't always work that well. But there is this just definite thing where we're just trying to make his karma the karma we want. And it's often because we're scared. We're just scared. It's the same question. What am I afraid of? Yeah. And the kid feels it. He feels, one of my young friends said to me, my mom just doesn't want me to do anything because if it happened to her, she wouldn't be able to deal with it. But I'm young, I'm strong. I think it's crazy. If it goes crazy, it's fun. My mom thinks that's terrible. I think it's fun. And he was absolutely right. She was imposing her fears on him and he would have none of it. I mean, those are just a few possible suggestions, but it's always, what am I afraid of? And why am I afraid?
So back to that, I think that the whole fear thing can bring us a full circle here, because I think that these days there is a lot of fear, just like there's a lot of, these other things, but the fear is probably is a major thing, right? Because of all the unknown and uncertainty. And you've talked a lot about it, but just in sort of summarizing it again about fear and addressing it and bringing it into the light, and then how we can move through that. Would you?
Well, I'm kind of going to go back to Eric. It's like you don't usually move through it. You just have to coexist with it. Especially if you're talking parents being fearful for their children. I can't imagine how you would not feel that way. You just want, everything about you wants what's good for them. So that fear has to be balanced with the awareness that Divine Mother is in charge. I'm not in charge. The ego gets inflated and it thinks that it's all up to me. I mean, how many thousands of lifetimes have we had? And this is just such a brief moment. The destiny of your child is not in your hands, but you can be a good friend to him while he explores his destiny. And that good friend to him, the more anxiety you bring to the relationship, the more he's compelled to push you aside. I mean, he doesn't want that. He doesn't want to have to hang out with your fear. He's trying to become a man in the world. He doesn't want to be surrounded by all this anxiety. So if you can't get over it, you have to ask Divine Mother to lift you at least as much as she can to get above it. Because you're not in charge of his destiny. That's the main thing you have to realize. I'm not in charge.
That's true of everything.
That's true of everything. This world we're living in now. I mean, when this started, Shurjo in India laughingly said, Nobody but Babaji could flip the whole globe over in a matter of days. He said it has to be Babaji. Any human who thinks they're responsible, they're completely wacky. And we really are. We are really in God's hands now. Nobody's in charge.
Well, it is 4 o'clock on the dot. And it's another amazing 3 hours of just wonderful satsang and inspiration. And we're just so grateful. And as you said, one of the great blessings now is that actually we're connecting more with you now than ever before. And it's really feeding our souls.
I'm very glad of that. And Pam, you have my email. You know how to find me. I can't quite live in your pocket, but I'm easy to find. Don't hesitate. There you are. You've got it. All right, my friends. Why don't we end with a prayer and then we'll say goodbye. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, dearest friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. May thy love shine forever on the sanctuary of our devotion, and may we be able to awaken thy love in all hearts. Om. Peace. Amen. Thank you all. It's been a delightful satsang.
Thank you, Asha. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And tomorrow it's Palo Alto weekend because tomorrow we have Keshava coming on.
Oh, that's great.
Everybody join us again for our Sunday satsang, and we'll get another flavor of our Palo Alto Guru Bhai. So
fabulous. Well, enjoy his.
Don't forget, you can always jump in onto Ananda Monterey Bay
After Dallas.
right after Dallas, where we'll be having guest speakers Ananta and Miriam McSweeney.
Oh, so it's a big day tomorrow.
Big day on the bay.
Okay.
all right. God bless everybody. Thank you, Asha.
Thank you.
Bye.